How you doing? My name is Bill Manning. I am a solution engineer at JFrog. I want to talk to you today about what I say, Wibbly, Wobbly, Timey, Wimey, Binaries. If you're a fan of Doctor Who, you will know that that's actually just one of the things. So basically, I'm going to talk to you today about what is Artifactory, what is JFrog, where does JFrog fit into here, and why are we here at GitHub Universe talking about binaries? Well, it's very simple. Where you have GitHub and you use that for everything around your source control and managing your code, building branches, doing all the things you do. When you produce code, you have third-party libraries. Well, those third-party libraries should be managed also, and that's what Artifactory does. We call ourselves the Universal Binary Repository Manager, and what that means is that we handle the dependencies, we handle the builds that you produce with the code that you have, that you use your GitHub source code, and then you have artifacts that are around it also. As stated, I'm William Manning. If you follow me on Twitter, you can also follow JFrog on Twitter at JFrog. And let's talk about standard development cycles. So in a standard cycle where you have things like GitHub and you're using it for your code, you plan all your binary releases, you plan how you're going to do things, you test, you release, you deploy. Well, where Artifactory comes in is a couple different ways. Think of it as like a conveyor belt as you're going through your development process. And from your source code, from your code development, all the way down to your deployment, all the way down to your releases, we can be there. So everything from those third-party libraries all the way down to the actual release itself. And the entire way, we try to scope the DevOps experience around what we do. We're not exactly the most forefront technology you'll have out there, but we're essential. And this allows you to have control over everything you do. Whenever I talk about how you use Artifactory or use our suite of products, what we do is we provide consistency. So consistency from the time your developers are developing all the way down to the time you release your software. Having that consistency throughout it ensures a steady release. Another thing we do is we also talk about simplicity. How do you actually implement Artifactory and make it so that it's part of what you do and it's behind the scenes, you don't even realize it's there. And we'll talk about that today also. And the last bit we're going to talk about is security. How do you ensure that the binaries that you're actually depending on are the same, are safe and going to actually keep your organization functional and not have any sort of security vulnerabilities? And we'll touch upon that also. So the suite of products that JFrog offers is a couple different things. So in the beginning, you can see where you have your Jenkins server safe, your CI, GitHub for when you do your check-ins. And you might want to deploy, say, a web service at the far end of this and say Kubernetes. Well, along the way, we have a whole series of products. We have Artifactory, the Universal Binary Repository Manager. We have our actual X-ray product, which actually scans those binaries, those third-party libraries, the builds you produce, to look for anything nefarious, anything that might cause issues in your organization. We have our product called Mission Control and Insight. This is all part of our higher-level platform, but Mission Control, if you have multi-site deployments, it allows you to kind of manage the entire system of your DevOps org. We have BinTray, which is actually our SaaS product, which allows you to distribute your binaries globally, and it's based on Akamai CDN, but also, too, we have our Enterprise Plus platform, where we've taken that, and you can actually distribute your own binaries based on your own CDM schema. So in a typical web server, you might have a whole bunch of things. You have a whole series of projects that you use. You have dependencies that depend on others. And one of the things I always talk about whenever I talk to organizations on how to think about using Artifactory in our suite of products in their org, the main thing that we come about with is planning. How do you plan your releases? Well, you should also plan the way you move binaries through the system. You have something like a Docker container, which contains many GitHub projects that are inside. Dependencies, the code itself, the core OS, all these kind of things. I mean, you can store your Docker files inside of GitHub and all that, but everything around it is encapsulated in it. So Artifactory can attribute to all these different layers of the Docker container. And by having that, you can make sure that those releases are just strategically well done. But also, too, if you're starting to deploy out to a web service, you're also going to want to have something like Kubernetes. And the thing is that you can see here, besides being a Kubernetes registry, besides being a Docker registry, besides the multitude, and I'll show you all the various binary types that you can do, you can use Artifactory from its inception to its delivery. I'm going to go and do a quick demo now, and I'm going to talk about Artifactory. I'm going to show you an example of where you can utilize it in, say, a web server. So like a web service is a very typical situation where you have code, you go through, you want to have your CI and your CD be as rapid as possible, you want to build as fast, you want to release as fast as possible, get it out there to the users. Well, how do you do that? Well, Artifactory can help you do that. So this is Artifactory itself. This is our screen. Now, I always preface it by saying that everything you see here in the UI is based on our API. So this is just a simple Angular 2 user interface on top of that. We also have a CLI tool out there. And one of the main benefits I actually want to touch on immediately is Artifactory has one key component that makes it even more robust. We use a checksum-based storage, and that checksum-based storage allows for more speed, accuracy, and efficiency, also removal of duplication. So any of those third-party libraries you're pulling in, say you have 1,000 projects, you would only store that once and everything is referenced via metadata. Now, the other part of the metadata side is being able to customize metadata around your organization, which is more pertinent to you. Now, I did mention the fact that we provide consistency. So I want to talk about a couple of different things in here. So we are universal. So if I were to go in here and look at local repositories, now local repositories are repositories that are matter to your organizations. Those are your builds. So when you do, say, a CI build using something like a Jenkins server, you pull in your projects, you pull in your third-party dependencies, and you build it out, and you want to deploy it somewhere, well, where would you store it? Normally, some people store it in an NFS, they store it somewhere else. Well, actually, Artifactory is probably your best option. And the reason why is we collect a whole series of metadata around that. It allows you to go back and look at it, evaluate it. If you have problems with it, it allows you to have remediation. It's a full, robust system that will allow your organization to excel in terms of development. So if I were to look at this, you could see all the various different types of repositories in which we actually, you can use. Everything from, say, Conan for CC++. If you're doing this sort of development in Python, NPM development, you name it, we can do it. You can also, like I said, use this as also a secure Docker registry, so you keep everything together. We have remote repositories, which are those third-party binaries that you are utilizing. And what we do is we do a cache proxy. So in other words, when you request those binaries, instead of having to go every time for every developer, for your CI, for your release, going out to the outside world, you can actually just have them pull into Artifactory and then deploy all around to your other parts of the organization. On top of that, you can apply our X-ray product, which I'll show you in a few minutes, which will scan those binaries to make sure they're safe and also allow compliance in terms of things like license governance. Now, I mentioned the fact that in Artifactory, if you wanted to deploy this and you want to have that simplicity, I'm going to show that. And then I want to talk about the CI/CD process and also development process from GitHub all the way down to your deployment. So one of the things that we do as a company is we provide nice, easy setup instructions. So if I were to create something around, say I'm a Gradle developer and I wanted to create something around that, we actually provide you with the easy setup instructions on how to actually generate that to actually set it up for your product. And the thing is that whenever JFrog takes on a new package type, we study it, we break it down, we build it into the product, and we learn to see how we can work within the natural paradigms of that package. So in other words, once you've implemented this as your solution to store those binaries, to get those third-party binaries, it seems natural. So if you were doing Docker, it would be Docker tag, Docker push, Docker pull. If you're doing anything with, say Python, it would be pip install. We try to keep it as native as possible. So once it's implemented, there's no deviation from the way your developers use it and the way your CI system uses it. Let's go take a look at what a typical job would look like. So I have an example here, and I want to show how along the way, every step in here, Artifactory is involved. This would be a typical workflow that you would have, say, in something like a web service, right? Where you actually have a back end, you have a front end, you have a container to encapsulate it. You're then deploying it under a service, such as Kubernetes, and you're deploying it out. Now, the entire method that you're going through here, if you look, I've got a Java backend, I've got a Node front end, I've got a Docker container, I'm creating a dynamic Helm chart. So this chart is actually being created based on the information above it. And I have these as actually a series of builds that are queued off by check-ins. So if I was to check in the code for my Gradle app that I have here, it would queue off the build of my CI/CD system, in this case Jenkins, and it will go through the subsequent steps to produce that web service. Now, the entire way that I'm doing this, not only am I consuming the source code from GitHub, I'm consuming the binaries, those third-party libraries that I depend on to build my products from Artifactory, but I'm also taking the end result of that and I'm storing it back in Artifactory. And that allows me to have a system of record, and I'm able to actually go through and look at the way things are being promoted through the system. Now, in addition to that, I mentioned planning earlier. So if I'm doing these kind of builds that I have here, one of the things that I want to ensure is that my repositories, the repositories I have in Artifactory, match my structure. And when I say that, it means everything from, say, planning with like development, QA, testing, staging, and release. And we have a thing called a promotion API inside of the actual product itself that allows you to have that system of record. In this case, I'm actually going to focus on one particular build here. And the build I'm going to be focusing on here actually has its Docker file stored in GitHub. It's actually, in this case, the build I'm doing is I'm cloning the project. I'm actually grabbing its dependencies from Artifactory. So the two previous builds, I have a Node front end and I have a Java back end. I'm actually building a container. I'm putting that container back into Artifactory. I'm running a unit test around that, and I'm providing more additional metadata back to say whether it passed or failed my test on this particular build. I'm actually performing an X-ray vulnerability scan to see if all the contents in there are actually safe and secure for my release. If they pass my litmus test on all of these, I then promote it from my staging repository up into my production repository for deployment. And what would that look like? Well, let's go take a look. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be storing all my builds into Artifactory. So everything that I'm doing as a developer, I can take it. I can either manually do it. I can do it through an automated process. We also have a CLI tool that will allow you to actually manually upload some of these. But the example I just showed you, what does that produce? Well, if I take a look here, here's the actual build that I referenced back in Jenkins. And when I show the build information that's around this, I can see everything that was produced during that build time, right? So here's the actual layers of that container. I can also show you the two previous components that I had, where here's my front end and my back end. I can look at all the environmental variables, all the system variables. If I have this connected to a Jira system, I can see what issues are there. I can look at all the licensing that's inside of this. But my biggest thing is that by having all this consolidated information, all this metadata around this build, one of the things is if you've ever worked with, say, something that's very high complex, such as a container, I can go in here and actually do a diff. So now, the builds that I produce in my automated process, if I need some sort of remediation behind this, I can go in and actually take a look and see what's changed. Everything from the artifact level of the layers of the container I produced, down to any dependencies. So if you look here, I've got a change in my UI, and I made the change there. And then lastly, I can see if any environmental variables have changed. Last thing I want to touch on is security. So I just kind of want to show you with our X-ray product, I'll just show you an example of how bad it can get. So the application I just showed you right there, one of the things that's around it is the fact that I actually went through and I made the worst of the worst in terms of what's inside of this container. If I do a search, and this is where binaries matter, and the reason why we are as a company is if you look here, I've actually got a container here that has a jar file inside of a jar, inside of a layer, inside of a build, and this one actually caused the leak of 140 million records. So as a whole, being able to encapsulate what we do as a company is the fact that we can manage your binaries from your dependencies down to your releases. You can go through and see how things were promoted. So like what I was showing before, in terms of this build that I had here, I have a release history to let me know this was released. And we can actually, where GitHub manages all your source code and does it excellent, we do the same thing in terms of binaries and your releases. Thank you so much. I'm Bill Manning. If you have any questions, you can go to try.jfrog.com and follow us there.